The other day, I noticed a devastating incongruity in the writings of New Testament textual critic Bart Ehrman in his case against the Church's historic confession in the absolute deity of Christ. On the one hand, several years ago, Ehrman wrote a book called How Jesus Became God. That book was wildly popular among rank and file readers, though it should be said that some of the scholars that he quotes in the book were not equally excited about how he appropriated, or I should say here, misappropriated some of the things that they had said in their own work. For example, Charles Gieshin took Ehrman to task for misappropriating things found in his scholarly work called angelomorphic Christology. But in any case, in that book, Ehrman argued not that Jesus literally became God or a God. Indeed, Ehrman's an atheist. He wouldn't believe such a thing. But in Ehrman's mind, the earliest Christians did believe that Jesus was God in some sense. And the question that he wanted to raise and answer in the book was how this came to be. Per Ehrman, the earliest sources that we have in the New Testament reflect what's called an adoptionistic Christology. That is, they taught along lines akin to Greco-Roman pagan religions that Jesus underwent a kind of apotheosis. That is, he was simply a man, but at some point was exalted to godhood. Now, to be sure, the New Testament scriptures speak of Jesus being exalted, but the Orthodox Christian confession is not that Jesus in that became a deity, whereas he wasn't before, but rather that Jesus, who is God and became man, is now in his resurrected and glorious body, exalted into heaven as the head of his church. They're interceding for us, governing the universe, and bringing it all to its appointed end, which will ultimately result in bringing many sons to glory. That is, those who are his body, those who are united to him as their head. But Ehrman alleges that this adoptionistic Christology can be found in such places as the Gospel of Mark. Allegedly, since Mark's Gospel presents the Father saying to Jesus at his baptism, "You are my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased," this is evidence for apotheosis, Jesus being adopted or received as a Son of God. However, this sort of thing is not consistent across the New Testament writings, according to Ehrman. Allegedly, when you get to the Gospel of John, you have Jesus being God in some sense that goes beyond an adoptionistic Christology. Ehrman wouldn't say it's full-blown Nicene Trinitarianism, but nevertheless, Jesus is presented as God in some sense, even prior to his baptism and even prior to his conception and birth. According to Ehrman, the Gospels of Matthew and Luke reflect that kind of Christology, where Jesus is already conceived of as Son of God by virtue of his virginal conception. In other videos, I've talked about how others have picked up this kind of idea and have tried to run with it and employ it in their own versions of attacking Christianity. And so, for example, you can see Muslims using this. You can see anti-missionary Jews like Rabbi Tovia Singer using it. So this is the sort of thing that's all the rage among anybody who wants to attack Christianity. However, while it's not only easily argued against that these Gospels present different Christologies, and I've done so on many occasions, but when you look at other writings of Ehrman's, it appears that Ehrman has had a falling out with himself, that Ehrman is not consistent in his argumentation across his works. Because in other places, when Ehrman wants to argue against the Gospels as bona fide canonical writings, that is, writings that have better claim over others to be the criteria by which the church's faith is measured, Ehrman will argue that the reason, for example, the four Gospels were chosen and are now the accepted canon of the Christian church is because the proto-Orthodox won the battle between the various Christologies that were afoot in the early centuries of the church. Here he's tapping into what's known as the Bauer thesis. According to Bauer, there was no one version of Christianity from the earliest days. There were multiple different forms of Christianity, and that included the proto-Orthodox, those who held the view that would come to dominate at Nicaea and Constantinople and Chalcedon. It included that, but it wasn't limited to that, and that one didn't have any greater claim to antiquity or the being rooted in the teaching of Christ and the apostles than any of the others.
Those of you who've heard me before know that when I use the term proto-Orthodoxy, I mean something kind of technical. This obviously isn't a word you hear every day standing in the grocery line, proto-Orthodoxy. But what I mean by proto-Orthodoxy is this. Eventually, within Christianity, as there were various groups fighting for who would be representing the right view of Christianity, one group emerged as saying, this is what Christianity is. This is what Christianity is supposed to believe. This is what Christianity is supposed to practice. This is what Christianity is. That group ended up becoming dominant, and it called itself the Orthodox Christians. They became Orthodox, meaning they were holding the right beliefs. Everybody else who held other beliefs were called heretics. And so, if you're a heretic, the word heretic comes from the Greek word for choice. A heretic is someone who's chosen not to believe the right belief. Orthodoxy is from two Greek words that mean right belief. And so, if you're Orthodox, you have the right belief. If you're a heretic, you've chosen the wrong belief because you like believing wrong things, I guess. The thing about orthodoxy and heresy, of course, is that everybody thinks they're orthodox. I mean, everybody thinks they're right. If you didn't think you were right, if what you thought you believed was wrong, you would change what you believe so you'd believe what was right. So by definition, you believe that you're right. You believe you're orthodox. So the other term that people use is heterodoxy. Heterodoxy means another belief. So you have orthodoxy, the right belief, and you got heterodoxy, the other belief. As one wag has put it, orthodoxy is my doxy, and heterodoxy is your doxy. So heterodoxy, orthodox. So why do I use the term proto-Orthodox? Well, there's one group of Christianity that ended up winning out, deciding what's to be believed. The other groups were declared at that point to be heresies. What about the people who believed that view before it became orthodoxy? That's what I call proto-Orthodoxy.
So, according to Ehrman, the reason that other gospels were not included in the final decision for what would be the canon of the New Testament, or part of the canon, the gospel portion of it, according to Ehrman, it's the proto-Orthodox that chose these. And the reason they chose these Gospels is because they best reflected their Christology. They aligned with what they believed about Jesus. So other Gospels, like the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Judas, or take your pick, these Gospels were excluded because they didn't teach the same view of Christ that the proto-Orthodox held, those very people who would come to dominate in the 4th century. But these two things just don't go together. The idea that the Gospels reflect an evolving Christology from lower to higher, from an adoptionistic Christology where Jesus becomes son at his baptism, or the slightly more exalted view of Jesus found allegedly in Matthew and Luke, where he's Son of God from his conception, to the greater notion of Christ as Son, even prior to the incarnation, found in John's Gospel. Because if you're arguing that the proto-Orthodox selected these Gospels because they reflect their Christology, and then you're turning around and arguing that these Gospels don't reflect that Christology after all, at least not uniformly, well then it seems that you've got two tracks that aren't really parallel. You've got two lines of argumentation that are altogether contrary to one another. It can't both be the case that these Gospels don't present a uniform orthodox witness to the deity of Christ, and they're chosen precisely because they reflect the beliefs of the proto-Orthodox.